Rain lashed Lexington Avenue like a whip that November night in 2025, drowning Baltimore in a cold, unforgiving flood that turned the cracked sidewalk into a slick, 2-inch deep mess. The temperature hovered at a bone-chilling 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind howled through the narrow street, rattling the faded neon sign of Lexington Diner, a buzzing relic that cast a dim, flickering glow across the chipped Formica counters inside. The air smelled of wet asphalt and exhaust, the kind of night where folks hurried past with their collars up, heads down, eager to escape the cold. Streetlights struggled to pierce the gloom, their weak orange beams glinting off the worn brick buildings and the pawnshop's cash for gold sign flickering across the road. It was late, past 11 p.m., and the diner's steel shutters should have been locked tight an hour ago. But Serena Carter wasn't the type to clock out when the world still had folks needing a warm spot to land. Inside, the diner hummed with the faint clatter of a jukebox stuck on some old Motown tune, its dollar coffee cups still scattered on tables from the last stragglers of the night shift. Serena stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a rag that had seen better days, her chestnut-brown skin damp with sweat despite the chill creeping through the thin glass windows. At 38, she was a fixture here, 5 feet 6 inches of quiet strength, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun after 12 grueling hours on her feet. She'd been pulling double shifts for years, earning $10 an hour plus whatever tips the regulars tossed her way, barely scraping together $25,000 a year. It was enough to cover the $900 rent on her one-bedroom apartment on West Fayette Street, where the heat flickered like a bad promise and the walls let in every neighbor's late-night TV chatter. But Serena didn't complain. She'd grown up knowing hard work was the only ladder out of tough spots, even if it left her sneakers soaked and her back screaming by midnight. She paused, rag in hand, her breath fogging slightly in the cool air seeping through the diner's drafty door. That's when she saw him. A small figure hunched just beyond the neon sign's glow, barely visible through the streaking rain. Serena squinted, leaning closer to the window. It was a boy, frail and slight, no more than 80 pounds, sitting in a battered wheelchair that creaked under his weight. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, dripping water into his wide blue eyes, and a tattered coat hung off his shoulders, doing nothing to shield him from the wet or the wind. His hands gripped a frayed blanket, soaked through and useless as he shivered in the shadows. Serena's frown deepened, a familiar ache tugging at her chest. She'd seen too many nights like this, too many folks left out in the cold, waiting for someone who might not show. "Not on my watch," she muttered, tossing the rag onto the counter. She pushed the diner door open, the icy wind slapping her face as she stepped out, rain stinging her skin like tiny needles. Her sneakers splashed through puddles as she crossed the 10 feet to the boy, crouching beside him so their eyes met. "Hey, sweetie," she called, her voice gentle but firm, cutting through the storm's roar. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The boy flinched at first, his thin frame tensing, then looked up, uncertainty swimming in those big blue eyes. "I'm waiting for my dad," he mumbled, his voice so soft it nearly drowned in the rain's drumming. Serena glanced up and down the empty street, nothing but the hiss of tires on wet asphalt and the pawnshop's flickering light. No dad, no car, just this kid, shivering like a leaf about to snap off a branch. "Where is he?" she pressed, concern creeping into her tone as she brushed a wet strand of hair from her face. The boy, Daniel, though she didn't know his name yet, shrugged, pulling the blanket tighter with trembling fingers. Serena exhaled, biting her lip. She'd grown up in a neighborhood where waiting was a gamble. Sometimes folks came back, sometimes they didn't. But leaving a kid like this, out here in this mess? That wasn't right. "Well, you can't stay out here," she said, offering a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Come inside with me, okay? It's warm, and I've got something special for you." Daniel hesitated, his gaze darting from her face to the diner's glowing windows, then back again. For a moment she thought he might say no, pride or fear holding him back, but then, slowly, he nodded, a tiny jerk of his head. Serena stood, gripping the wheelchair's handles with care, her hands steady despite the cold biting into her knuckles. The wheels squeaked as she pushed him across the uneven pavement, rain soaking her uniform as she maneuvered him through the door. The diner's warmth hit them like a hug, wrapping them in the scent of buttered toast and burnt coffee, a comfort she'd built from scratch over years of late nights. She guided Daniel to a booth near the radiator, its faint hum promising heat, and grabbed a fresh towel from the stack behind the counter. "Here you go," she said, draping it over his narrow shoulders, crouching again to meet his eyes. "I'm Serena. What's your name, sweetheart?" He sniffed, fingers curling around the towel's edge. "Daniel," he said, voice still shaky but clearer now. Serena nodded, her grin widening. "That's a strong name. You hungry?" He nodded again, hesitant but eager, and she didn't wait for more. She was already moving toward the kitchen, her heart set on giving this kid something good, something to chase the cold away. Across the street, unseen in the shadows of a sleek black Bentley, Raymond Holt watched it all, his sharp gray eyes narrowing, his mind already turning. But Serena didn't know that yet. All she knew was the boy in front of her, and the chance to make one night a little better. The warmth of Lexington Diner wrapped around Serena Carter and Daniel like a soft blanket as she wheeled him to that booth near the radiator, the faint hum chasing away the last of the 40-degree Fahrenheit chill clinging to his soaked frame. Rain still lashed the windows outside like a whip, drumming a steady beat against the glass. But inside, the world felt smaller, safer. Serena had seen the uncertainty in Daniel's wide blue eyes when she'd brought him in from the storm, his frail hands clutching that useless, dripping blanket. Now, as she crouched beside him, towel draped over his narrow shoulders, she saw something shift. Those eyes softening, a flicker of trust breaking through the guarded wall he'd built. "You're going to be just fine in here, Daniel," she said, her voice warm as the steam rising from the kitchen. "Let's get some food in you. Warm you up, right?" He nodded again, a little quicker this time, his shivering slowing as the radiator's heat seeped into his bones. Serena straightened up, brushing damp strands of hair from her face, and headed for the kitchen, her sneakers squeaking on the worn linoleum floor. She'd been on her feet for 12 hours, her $10 an hour shift stretching past closing, but the ache in her legs faded as she grabbed a loaf of sourdough from the shelf. She sliced it with practiced ease, the knife gliding through the crust, her hands steady despite the late hour. A slab of butter hit the griddle, sizzling into a golden puddle, and she layered on thick slices of cheddar, $2 worth from the diner's stash, watching it melt into gooey perfection. Next came a bowl of tomato soup, a recipe her grandma swore by, simmering in a pot she'd kept warm for stragglers. She ladled it out, the rich red steaming up to her nose, and carried the plate back to Daniel, setting it down with a gentle clink. "Grilled cheese and soup, my go-to fix for a rough night," she said, tucking a napkin into his lap. "This one's on me, sweetheart." Daniel's eyes widened as he stared at the golden sandwich, cheese stretching in long, gooey strings as he took his first bite. "This is the best thing I've ever had," he murmured, his voice trembling with something close to wonder, a crack of awe breaking through his usual quiet. Serena chuckled, leaning against the booth, watching as he devoured it, his small fingers clumsy but eager. Tomato soup splashed onto his chin, staining the napkin red, and he laughed. A soft, bubbling sound that lit up the dim diner like a spark. "Messy eater, huh?" she teased, grabbing another napkin to wipe his face with a trembling hand, her exhaustion melting under the glow of his fragile grin. He grinned, swinging his legs under the table, the wheelchair creaking faintly with each kick. "My mom used to make me sandwiches, but not like this," he said, his voice dreamy, eyes far off for a moment before snapping back to her. "You're really nice, Serena." That hit her square in the chest, a warm ache spreading through her ribs. She'd heard thanks before, gruff nods from truckers, shy smiles from kids, but this was different. Daniel's words carried a weight, a fragile gratitude that made her throat tighten. "Good food makes everything better," she said lightly, brushing it off. But inside, she felt the familiar pull, another soul she couldn't leave hanging, not when the world had already kicked him down too hard. She sat across from him, resting her elbows on the table, letting him eat in peace, his laughter filling the quiet like a melody she hadn't known she needed. Across the street, hidden behind the tinted windows of his sleek black Bentley, Raymond Holt sat motionless, the rain streaking down his windshield like tears he'd never shed. His mind spun like a storm, his gray eyes sharp as steel, piercing the diner's glow, stunned by what he couldn't unsee. At 46, he'd built Holt Dynamics, a $1 billion tech empire in Baltimore, on control, precision, and a ruthlessness that left no room for softness. He'd been delayed by a call, an investor crisis in Japan costing him $500,000 if he didn't fix it, telling Daniel to wait just 10 minutes outside. Now, those minutes stretched, and here was this woman, a black waitress in a $5 apron, feeding his boy for free, coaxing a laugh he hadn't heard in months. His mind churned, disbelief warring with something deeper, a debt he couldn't name. "Who is she?" he muttered, fingers tightening on his phone, the cold leather of the seat creaking under his grip. Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside that diner, something had shifted, and Raymond felt it, even if he didn't want to. The rain hadn't let up outside Lexington Diner, its fierce lash a backdrop to the quiet warmth inside where Serena Carter sat across from Daniel, watching him finish his tomato soup with a grin that lit up his pale face. That laugh he'd let slip, a soft, bubbling sound, still echoed in her ears, a rare bright spot after her 12-hour shift at $10 an hour. She'd wiped his chin with a trembling hand, her exhaustion melting under the glow of his fragile grin as she leaned back in the booth, the radiators hum a steady comfort against the 40-degree chill seeping through the diner's thin walls. Daniel swung his legs under the table, the wheelchair creaking faintly, and for a moment, Serena let herself believe this was enough. Just one kid, one night made a little better. But across the street, in the shadows of his $80,000 Bentley, Raymond Holt's mind spun like a storm, his gray eyes, sharp as steel, piercing the scene, stunned by what he couldn't unsee. That simple act, Serena feeding his son for free, had cracked something in his steel-walled world, and he wasn't a man who let cracks go unchecked. Raymond's fingers tightened around his phone, the cold leather of the driver's seat creaking as he shifted. He'd built Holt Dynamics into a $1 billion tech empire in Baltimore with a ruthless edge. No favors, no debts unpaid. But here was this woman, a black waitress in a $5 apron, showing Daniel a kindness he hadn't seen since his wife passed 5 years ago. His jaw clenched, the memory of telling Daniel to wait outside, just 10 minutes, stinging sharper now. That call with Japan had cost him $500,000 if he'd hung up, but this was something else. "Nora," he barked into the phone, his voice low and clipped as his assistant picked up. "Get down to Lexington Diner. No suits, no heels. 20 minutes. Find out everything you can about the woman who just fed my son." There was a pause, Nora's hesitation crackling through the line, then a cautious, "Sir?" Raymond's grip tightened, his mind a whirlwind. Everything. Name, address, background. Now. He hung up, his breath fogging briefly in the car's chilled interior, his thoughts already calculating. Inside the diner, Serena didn't know she was being watched. She was too busy soaking in Daniel's chatter, his shy admission that he liked comics, his wonder at the grilled cheese she'd made with $2 worth of cheddar. The door swung open, cold air rushing in like a slap, and a woman stepped through, blonde hair tucked under an Orioles cap, jeans and a hoodie hiding her sharp edges. Serena's instincts flared. She'd served enough late-night stragglers to spot someone who didn't fit. The woman, Nora, though Serena didn't know her name, crouched beside Daniel with a smile too smooth, too rehearsed. "Hey, champ, time to go," she said, her tone light but off. Daniel frowned, clutching his napkin. But I haven't finished my milk. Nora tilted her head. Take it with you. Your ride's waiting. Serena folded her arms, eyes narrowing. You know him? She asked, voice steady. Nora's smile didn't falter, but her shoulders tightened. Yeah, I'm his aunt. Serena turned to Daniel, crouching low. That true, sweetheart? He hesitated, a beat too long, and Nora's jaw twitched. She's here for my dad, he mumbled. I guess I have to. Serena didn't buy it, but she handed him a 50-cent chocolate chip cookie wrapped in wax paper. For the road, she said, forcing a grin as Nora wheeled him out, her gut screaming something wasn't right. Across the street, Raymond watched Nora load Daniel into the Bentley, his son's small frame swallowed by the back seat. The door shut with a soft thud, and Nora slid in beside him, her report crisp. She's sharp, she said, pushing back her hood. Didn't buy the aunt story. Almost called me out. Raymond's expression stayed stone cold, his mind still spinning. But she let him go. Nora nodded. Didn't have a choice. A black woman making a scene? She'd be the one in trouble. Raymond's jaw twitched, a flicker of something, guilt maybe, crossing his thoughts. She's not like the others, Nora added. He already knew that. I want everything on her, he said, fastening his seatbelt. Name, address, background, on my desk by morning. Nora hesitated. Sir? Morning, he snapped, and the Bentley pulled away, the diner shrinking in the rear view. By 1 a.m., Serena trudged up the stairs to her West Fayette Street apartment, her sneakers soaked from the 2-mile walk home, the $12 in tips weighing light in her pocket. The hallway smelled of mildew, the heat barely kicking on in her $900 a month one-bedroom. She leaned against the door, rubbing her face, Daniel's grin lingering in her mind, until a knock jolted her upright. Peering through the peephole, she saw a man, tall, broad-shouldered, in a $1,000 black coat that screamed money. His gray eyes were cold, assessing. Who is it? She called, hand on the lock. Raymond Holt, came the deep, controlled reply. Her stomach flipped. What do you want? To talk. Her gut roared a fierce, hell no. But a spark of reckless curiosity dragged her forward and she cracked the door. I don't know you, she said flatly. No, he replied, but you know my son. Realization hit. Daniel's dad. She studied him, his spotless shoes clashing with her peeling hallway. You were watching, she said, voice tight. I was. He stepped forward, placing a thick envelope on her rickety table. A job offer, Holt Dynamics. 6 figures, benefits, the works. Serena laughed, sharp and incredulous. You think a check makes us even? Raymond didn't flinch. It's not charity, it's an investment. Her chest tightened. 100,000 meant no more 20 grocery stretches, but her mom's voice echoed, they take more than they give. I'll think about it, she muttered, clutching the envelope, her pride and exhaustion at war as he left without another word. Days later, Serena stepped into Holt Dynamics' gleaming $1 million lobby, her $20 department store blazer a stark contrast to the marble floors. Eyes followed her, judging, calculating, as she rode the elevator to the 20th floor. Raymond greeted her with a curt, You're late by 2 minutes. His office a sterile expanse of glass and steel. Nora lingered, her good luck, Miss Carter, dripping with doubt, while Eric Calloway, a slick exec with a $500 tie, smirked from the hall. New girl won't last, he muttered, loud enough to sting. Serena squared her shoulders, the envelope's weight still heavy in her mind. 100,000 a year, a chance to climb, but already she felt the knives sharpening behind her back. Serena Carter had barely settled into her new role at Holt Dynamics, the $100,000 a year job still feeling like a tightrope she was learning to walk. 2 months in, she'd carved out a space, her thrift store blazer swapped for a $50 clearance rack suit, her voice steady in meetings despite the sidelong glances from suits like Eric Calloway, who'd pegged her as an outsider from day one. She'd faced down Philip Langford and his Orion Group cronies, saving thousands of jobs with a sharp tongue and sharper numbers, earning a rare nod from Raymond Holt. "I knew I hired you for a reason." But that Thursday afternoon in January 2026, as she stepped off the elevator onto the 20th floor, the air felt different, thicker, charged with something she couldn't name. Nora Winters intercepted her in the hallway, her usual cool mask cracked, eyes darting. "We have a problem," she said, voice sharp as a blade, shoving a printed email into Serena's hands. Serena's stomach sank as she scanned the page. It was a classified financial report, Holt Dynamics quarterly projections, sensitive data worth millions, leaked to the press. And there, at the top, her name blazed in bold. Forwarded by Serena Carter. Her breath caught, the paper trembling in her grip. "This isn't mine," she snapped, her voice low but fierce, eyes locking onto Nora's. "I know," Nora replied, her tone clipped, "but someone wants it to be." Her pulse hammered in her ears like a war drum, words blurring as raw panic tore at her chest. She'd seen this playbook before. A black woman in a white world didn't get a fair shake. If this stuck, it wasn't just her job on the line, it was her whole life. $100,000 a year, her $1,500 a month house, every inch she'd clawed out of nothing. "Who else has seen this?" she demanded. Nora's answer was a gut punch. "Raymond." And the board. Serena swore under her breath, the 20th floor hallway closing in like a trap. Raymond's office felt colder than usual, the $1 million glass walls reflecting the gray Baltimore skyline like a prison. He sat behind his pristine desk, hands clasped, his sharp gray eyes cutting through her the second she walked in. Serena slammed the email down, the slap echoing in the sterile space. "This isn't me," she said, voice steady despite the storm raging inside. Raymond didn't look at the paper. He didn't need to. "I want to believe that," he said, his tone low, controlled. "But this is serious, Serena. Millions in exposure. Stock could drop 10%, $50 million gone. Investigations, headlines." He paused, letting the weight settle. "You understand how bad this is?" Serena planted her hands on his desk, leaning in. "I understand perfectly. I also understand someone's playing me, pinning this on the new girl, the outsider, the black woman who's too loud for their liking. Who's going to believe me over some exec with a $500 tie and 10 years here?" Raymond didn't flinch, but his silence stretched too long, his gaze weighing her like a judge. "Do you think I did this?" she asked, nails digging into her palms. Raymond held her stare, unblinking. "No." The word hit like a lifeline, and the breath she'd been holding slipped out. "But," he added, "the board does." Serena paced, her $50 heels clicking against the marble. "So they're ready to cut me loose. 100,000 job, gone, just like that?" Raymond stood, his $1,000 coat rustling. "We find the real leak." Serena froze, turning to him. "We? Not you, not me, we." The ice in her chest cracked, a flicker of hope breaking through. "Nora's tracing the email's source," he said, adjusting his cufflinks. "It's routed through an external server. Someone covered their tracks well. We'll have to be smarter." Serena crossed her arms. "And if we don't find them in time? If the board axes me?" Raymond's jaw tightened. "Then we make them regret it." His voice carried a steel she hadn't heard before, and for the first time, she believed he'd fight for her. That night, Serena and Nora holed up in a cramped server room, coffee cooling in $2 mugs as they combed through digital logs. The clock ticked past midnight, the 20-inch monitor glowing with lines of code and timestamps. Serena's eyes burned, but she didn't blink. 100,000 wasn't just a paycheck, it was her lifeline. Nora tapped the screen. Here, routed through a secondary account. Eric Calloway's Serena's gut twisted. Calloway, the slick exec who'd smirked at her from day one. Bank transfers, Nora muttered, pulling up records. $50,000 to a reporter's account tied to his IP. Serena's hands clenched. He framed me. Raymond joined them, his $200 tie loosened, eyes narrowing at the evidence. Enough to bury him, he growled. Get it ready. Friday morning, Serena stormed into the boardroom, a $5 folder stuffed with proof slamming onto the mahogany table. The air was thick, 15 suits and $1,000 jackets staring her down like she was already toast. Raymond sat at the head, unreadable, while Eric Calloway lounged 2 seats over, his $500 tie gleaming. An older board member smirked, gesturing to a chair. Miss Carter, I assume you know why you're here. Serena didn't sit. I do, she shot back, and I assume you know you're about to make a $50 million mistake. Murmurs rippled, but she pressed on, sliding the folder forward. I was the easy target. New hire, outsider, black woman who doesn't bow, but you picked the wrong one. Eric bolted up, voice shrill. This is ridiculous. She's bluffing. Serena turned to Raymond, brow raised. Am I? Raymond's voice sliced through, cold as steel. No, she's not. The room froze. Emails, transfers, call logs, all Calloway's, she said, tapping the papers. Legal's got copies. So does the press. Eric's face drained white, his "she's lying" choking out as Raymond stood. Effective immediately, Calloway's terminated, full legal action. The boardroom went dead silent. Serena didn't smile. She didn't need to. She'd turned the game on its head, and they all knew it. The boardroom at Holt Dynamics fell into a silence so thick it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. The echo of Raymond Holt's words, effective immediately, Calloway's terminated, full legal action, hanging heavy over the long mahogany table. Serena Carter stood tall, her $5 folder of damning evidence still splayed out in front of the 15 suits who'd been ready to bury her just minutes ago. Her heart pounded, but she didn't let it show. Not a tremble, not a blink. She'd faced down the leak that could have cost the company $50 million, turned the tables on Eric Calloway, and now the room was hers. Calloway slumped back into his chair, his $500 tie askew, face pale as the marble floors outside, his earlier bluster, "She's bluffing," reduced to a pathetic whimper. Serena's eyes flicked to Raymond at the head of the table, his sharp gray gaze steady, unreadable, but she caught the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, a crack in his steel facade. Raymond rose, his $1,000 coat rustling like a battle flag, his calm a deliberate mask over a brewing storm that made the suits shift uncomfortably in their seats. Anyone else in this company thinks they can play the same game, he said, his voice low and cold as the 40-degree Fahrenheit rain that had started this whole mess. Let this serve as a warning. His eyes swept the room, landing on each board member, men who'd built fortunes on $1 million deals but now looked like scolded kids caught with their hands in the cookie jar. Serena felt the weight lift off her chest, a breath she hadn't known she was holding slipping out. Raymond had stood by her, really stood by her, not just with words, but with action. Calloway's termination wasn't a suggestion. It was a guillotine, and Raymond had dropped the blade himself. Security's waiting, Raymond added, nodding to the door. Eric, get out. Calloway stumbled to his feet, muttering something incoherent, and slunk out, tail between his legs, the $50,000 he'd pocketed from the leak now a noose around his neck. The board didn't explode into chaos. Men like these didn't shout when they were rattled. Instead, murmurs rippled, a low hum of unease and reluctant nods. Serena caught snippets. $500,000 for ethics training. Tighter server locks, as they scrambled to patch the hole Calloway's stunt had blown open. An older member, the one with the thin-lipped smirk from earlier, cleared his throat. We'll need a full review, he said, avoiding Serena's gaze. This can't happen again. Another nodded. Agreed. $1 million in PR damage control if the stock dips. Serena crossed her arms, her $50 heels planted firm. She'd walked in as the scapegoat, a black woman they'd pegged to take the fall for a $50 million mess, and now they were rewriting rules because she'd flipped their game. It wasn't a cheer-worthy win, not yet, but it was power, raw and real, shifting under her feet. Raymond didn't sit back down. He adjusted his cufflinks, a $200 pair that gleamed under the boardroom lights, and turned to Serena, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "You're still here because you're worth it," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Anyone disagrees, they can take it up with me." The board went quiet again, a few heads dipping in grudging respect. Serena's jaw tightened, not from fear now, but from something fiercer. She'd proven herself, not just to them but to him, the man who'd pulled her from a $25,000 a year diner life into this $100,000 a year fight. She met his gaze, her voice steady. "Good to know," she said, a faint smirk tugging her lips. "Wouldn't want to waste your time." Raymond's eyes flickered. Amusement, maybe, or something closer to pride, but he didn't reply, just gave a curt nod that felt like a seal on their pact. As the board filed out, their $1,000 suits rustling, Serena stayed put, the folder still in front of her. Raymond lingered too, loosening his $200 tie as the last suit disappeared. The silence between them wasn't tense anymore. It was different, heavier, laced with something unspoken. "You did good, Carter," he said finally, his tone softer, less like the billionaire CEO and more like a man who'd just seen a war won. Serena leaned against the table, arms crossed. "Damn right I did," she shot back, her smirk widening into a real grin. He didn't laugh. Raymond Holt didn't do that, but the corner of his mouth twitched again, a crack widening in that steel wall. "Calloway thought he could bury you," he said almost to himself. He didn't know who he was messing with. Serena tilted her head. "Neither did you, at first." Raymond's gaze held hers, a beat too long, and for the first time she saw something shift. A quiet trust, forged in the fire of that boardroom brawl. The $1 million building hummed around them, but in that moment, it was just the two of them. Serena, the diner waitress who'd fed his son, and Raymond, the billionaire who'd bet on her. She'd started this journey with a $5 meal, and now she'd just saved his empire from a $50 million fall. Their bond wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was something stronger, a mutual respect carved out of chaos. "What now?" she asked, voice softer but still sharp. Raymond straightened his tie. "Now we keep going," he said, turning for the door. "You're not done here." Serena watched him go, the weight of her $100,000 job settling in, not as a burden now, but as a weapon. She'd survived the storm, and she wasn't about to stop swinging. The dust settled at Holt Dynamics after that boardroom showdown, and Serena Carter didn't just survive, she rose. 2 years later, in 2028, her name gleamed on an executive office door. Vice President of Corporate Strategy, a $150,000 a year title she'd carved out with grit and guts. The $20 thrift store blazer was long gone, replaced by a $200 suit that fit her like armor, but Serena hadn't forgotten the $900 a month apartment on West Fayette Street. Now, she lived in a $2,000 a month house in Roland Park, Baltimore, a 2-story with a porch where she sipped $3 coffee every morning, watching the sunrise over a life she'd built from nothing. She'd turned Holt Dynamics into something more than a $1 billion tech machine, pushing $2 million into ethical labor projects, keeping jobs local, not overseas, because she knew what it felt like to scrape by on $25,000 a year. Raymond Holt watched her climb, his sharp gray eyes softening over time. He'd stood by her when the board wanted her gone, and now he leaned on her, her voice in meetings as steady as his, her ideas sharper than the $500 ties the suits wore. Their bond, forged in that $50 million leak crisis, had grown into a quiet partnership, a trust that didn't need words. Serena wasn't just a hire anymore, she was a force, and Raymond knew it. But the real proof came on a warm June day in 2029, when Daniel Holt rolled across a high school stage in his wheelchair, gripping a diploma like it was gold. At 15, his frail frame, still hovering around 80 pounds, belied the fire in his blue eyes. "I told you I'd make it," he shouted, grinning at Serena in the front row, his voice cutting through the crowd's applause. Serena laughed, ruffling his dark hair as he wheeled over, her $10 diner days a distant memory. "Never doubted you for a second, kid," she said, her throat tight with pride. Raymond stood beside her, his $1,000 coat swapped for a casual jacket, a rare smile tugging his lips. "You did good, Carter," he said, echoing that boardroom win years ago. "Damn right I did," she shot back, their old rhythm intact. Daniel glanced between them, smirking. "Are you guys gonna hug or something?" Raymond sighed. "Absolutely not," while Serena rolled her eyes. "God, no." But the kid's grin said it all. This wasn't just a job or a paycheck. It was family, built from a $5 meal on a rainy night. For Serena, it was more than a climb. It was a rewrite. That diner moment when she'd fed a shivering boy had sparked a life she'd never imagined. Kindness started it, she'd say if you asked her now, and it's what keeps it going. From $25,000 to $150,000, from a $900 rental to a $2,000 home, she'd turned struggle into strength and pulled others up with her. Daniel was proof, his diploma a beacon of what she'd fought for. Years rolled on, and by 2032, Serena Carter stood at the helm of the Carter-Holt Foundation, a $5 million community center rising on Baltimore's east side. A brick and glass beacon for kids who'd known $25,000 a year struggles like she once had. As vice president of Holt Dynamics, she'd poured her $150,000 salary into this dream, funding scholarships and job training for underserved youth. On opening day, she cut the ribbon with trembling hands, tears blurring her view of the $1 million facility, classrooms buzzing, a gym echoing with laughter. Daniel Holt, now 18 and a college freshman, wheeled beside her, his $50 cap tilted proudly. "You did this, Serena," he said, grinning, his voice stronger than the frail 80-pound frame he'd carried as a boy. She ruffled his hair, her $200 suit a far cry from the $5 apron she'd worn that rainy night. The foundation wasn't just bricks, it was her legacy, a ripple from a $5 meal that fed a shivering kid and changed everything. Teens who'd faced $900 rents now had a shot at college, their futures brighter than the neon of Lexington Diner ever was. Serena looked out at the crowd, middle-class families, seniors who'd hustled through life, and saw herself in them. "Kindness builds more than money ever could," she said, voice steady, echoing her journey from $25,000 to $150,000, from struggle to strength. It was a lesson for folks who'd fought hard, seen hard times, a reminder that one good deed can echo forever. Raymond watched from the sidelines, his $1,000 coat traded for a sweater, pride in his gray eyes. Serena had turned his empire and his heart into something bigger. That $5 act of compassion, it didn't just save Daniel, it built a future worth believing in.